As I believe I've explained elsewhere, there are two Greek words for time. They have different senses. They're chronos and keros. The former refers to entropy, to passing time that eats away at things. You'll note that the Titan Chronos eats his children. You'll note the fancy Greek-derived word for clock, chronometer, a measuring device, a meter of passing time, chronos. But keros instead refers to timeless time, to the right time or ideal time, for example, the right time to sow crops. Hence the modern Greek meaning of the word kalokeri, or summer, or weather, and hence summer being kalo, good, keri, weather. Kalokeros, or just keros really, is a word used in a sacred context as well, referring to a kind of sacred or mythical time. Now, this distinction between two types of time allows us to quite easily understand one difference between history and mythology. Mythology occurs in keros, in a kind of sacred, timeless time. Mythology isn't just, I'm not just talking about the pagan, Greek, Egyptian, the Norse, Japanese stuff, but also any pre- or non-historic story in which time's significance is lessened. It's not understood when something happened, or it doesn't really matter exactly when it happened. It's ahistoric. For example, for Christians, you'd have the time of the saints. It lasted roughly from around 100 AD to 330, and this interval, give or take dates, obviously the dates are completely impossible to pin down, but this rough interval was stuffed full of myths of Christian saints. They couldn't possibly have literally existed from what we know of the circumstances of the time. But that time period is sort of overflowing with stories about martyrs, even though it's physically far too short a time for them to have all existed at this time and to all have been persecuted in the ways that we say they were. And so they're all relegated to a kind of timeless, holy moment, which in my more fanciful moments I think is maybe represented by the gold in the background of icons. Mythologized as well, perhaps more comprehensibly for an English audience, would be the time of King Arthur. In factual terms, they've worked out that the myth came from the beginning of the 12th century, I think, but since what we know about that period doesn't accord with what's in the story, King Arthur couldn't have existed, at least in the form that we know of him, so he's sort of transcended history and he's turned into myth. But there's this metaphoric truth to Arthur and all the saints which transcends time, despite time being recorded both before and after them in quite an accurate way in different places around the world. But I think both of those examples serve as perhaps better examples for explaining myths than the old pagan stuff, because they ostensibly happened during a time period for which we have written records, in which history, quote-unquote, existed, so it becomes easier to see the difference. I also think, perhaps as an aside, that everyone's childhood, quite dimly remembered for most of us, distorted events happen to us discreetly, separated, and they're each surrounded by these sorts of clouds of forgetfulness. I think everyone's childhood is a kind of personal mythology from which the history of our life can begin, already loaded with symbols and eternal figures, which for most of us I suspect would be our parents, among others. But I also wanted to talk more generally about history. History isn't just the passing of time. History is the presence of the past. The past is what once was. History coalesces identity. Without a consistent history, you're a ship of Theseus. You stop dead in your tracks, because without a past, there's no future and there's no reason to do anything. This is why, if I had no name, I could go out in public and I could do anything and I could be totally unashamed. I wouldn't let any thoughts about time, the past or the future affect me. There would be nobody in my physical space, no identity with the capacity to be ashamed. And that's the danger of people who don't know their history. Adam and Eve were happy naked in the garden until they understood time. And in the garden they lived in keros, and when they were exiled, in chronos. History or time began. So when you're young, you build up that mythology, and a mythology is what allows you to have a history, because to have a history, you need to have a sort of fundamental layer underneath it on which to build. You need some kind of axiomatic reference, and that, in part, is a mythology. The more of the past you understand, and the more of the world you understand, the bigger you become. But we'll get to that. History is the record of the past, and it's the knowledge of the absence of a record. A known absence of a record is also a record or a presence. But if you want to return to a prehistoric, or more accurately an ahistoric time, you don't need to destroy anything, except all people above the age of 2. Everything will be forgotten immediately. Mankind will enter an Edenic pre-fall state for at least a decade. History will begin again when we all turn 12 and learn to remember, probably sooner than that. But we need to build that mythology first, in childhood. In Morrowind terms, because I like to quote unorthodox sources, once we understand the events that happen to us, those events become history. Otherwise, we're just animals trying to get out of the cold. When something is over, its role in your life is that of a finished object. Finished in a divine way, like Zeus and Jesus were considered finished. When the history is over, in other words, when it can be retold and reframed. Teleosis, it's called in all the old philosophy. A word that nowadays means a kind of organic perfection, but once it meant an accomplishment, a fulfillment, an event which verified a promise. The past, the finished historical event, can be inspected, remembered, analyzed from every side, worshipped as perfect. It's become a complete object. It's a sacred story. It can be told with a beginning, middle, and ending. To remember is to give a limb to what was. Again, member, a limb, an extension, an acting force. To say that I remembered something means that you gave it arms once more. You let the dead, or the finished, the perfect, the sacred thing, influence the world, though dead. Or to recall something, I called it again. I summoned it to a place and time that it wasn't. But I think that a person isn't finished, isn't complete, until they can imagine themselves doing everything. Until they can visualize themselves committing all the atrocities humanity's committed. I know I can. I've watched myself in my mind's eye committing most crimes. And please stop listening and think about that for a moment. Perhaps you think that makes me monstrous. And if we met, you wouldn't be able to meet my eye. That would be a sad thing, no matter who you are. Perhaps you believe you're different. You're incapable of evil. This is a dangerous belief. It's a corollary to the belief that others who commit evil have lost an essential human quality, which you believe you have. To assume you're above an action is to assume that people who've committed it are below you on the scale of possible humanity. And to believe that makes you a very dangerous person. You can be very easily convinced to hate those people, ostracize them, kill them. When somebody dehumanizes their enemy in that way, I stop trusting them. They're the dangerous kind of hypocrite, and we'll get to hypocrites in a minute. But there are dangerous and there are benign hypocrites. To live a proper and full life, I think, at the moment anyway, I may change my view on this, as I change my view on almost everything, you must accept that you're capable of evil. The world is a hypocritical place. Everything's upside down. To avoid committing evil, you must first understand you are capable of it. But that's a quite base observation these days. I think everyone knows that quite well by now. You might think this sounds like the observation of somebody who wants to be a deep character. Well, of course I do. Who doesn't, after all? But people talk about deep characters. They talk about, and this is perhaps a great segue into our next topic, heroes. What's a hero? In the opening crawl of Star Wars Episode 3, they say there are heroes on both sides, and of course people who don't know anything tend to sort of mock that and mock George Lucas because they think that he's an idiot, and they're wrong, by the way, and they think that a hero is the same thing as a protagonist. A hero is not a protagonist. The word's Greek. You should be thinking immediately, when you hear this word, about the Trojan War. Achilles on one side, Hector on the other, both heroes. To this day, thanks to his quite even-handed treatment, There's actual academic doubt as to whether Homer, assuming that he existed in the first place, was Greek or Trojan. I might just take a minute to escape from these fragments that I'm collating a video together from, to recommend a book to you, which is The Ancient Greek Hero in 24 Hours by Gregory Nagy, published, I think, by Harvard University Press. I've been slowly making my way through it, and it is quite interesting. It is a strong recommendation. It's quite heavy, though, so maybe sit down with a cup of coffee and take your time with it. But a hero is somebody who exists more than other people. What I'm about to say, by the way, might overlaps slightly with the book, but I think that I go into a few rather different places, mostly on account of the fact that I cite absolutely no sources. A hero is somebody who exists more than other people. There's more of one person filling the available space of the universe. They exist more. More is written about them, more is said about them, they do more, people think about them more, they take up more room. They're more intense in whatever they're doing, but that's just an outer manifestation. The truth is, you could say, they have great souls. Now, as you get older, you'll find that you grow in a similar way. There's more of you, and there are parts of you that only activate at certain times. I think perhaps the best example of this that I hope many of you will understand is the professional self. A lot of people have a different personality, they have different boundaries, different values to those that they choose to show in their professional lives when they're at work. So you have a professional self and you have a personal self. And as you get older, your experience in both of those places, your history in both of those places grows to take up the area or to take up the memory of a full person. So you effectively have two different faces. Now, let's call those faces aspects. I see some of you know already where I'm going with this. You have a professional aspect, and those with whom you work know you entirely through that aspect. To them, that's you. They can't comprehend the rest. It's hidden by the various sides of your personality. And the more of you exists, the more heroic you are, the more aspects you have. Sooner or later, you might be so heroic that your aspects are named and are considered separate from you. And that's when we get into divine territory. You have Zeus, the bringer of thunder, Vronteos, Zeus, the lord of the flies, Zeus Dicteos, or perhaps as the Orthodox might know, Panagia Myrtidiotisa, Panagia Fidhusa. These are aspects too. I think possibly this is one meaning of made in the image of God. It's that we can have the ability to develop aspects that are full-blown personalities. It's not that we're schizoid. It's that we can have these different faces that are formed by incomprehensible essences, that we're in a sense worshipped or frozen or made divine, finished, teleosis, by the limited perceptions of the people around us. More on heroes. I think some politicians have been heroes, but they were sacrificed heroes, and they were sacrificed in the following way: by becoming politicians. By becoming powerful and public property, they've traded themselves. The amount of power somebody holds is inversely proportional to the amount of time that he can afford to be himself, i.e., not be driven by the necessity of ruling over others and making significant choices. At least this should apply to a good politician. All this person's time is spent on the necessary, on pressing public things. Power has an inverse relationship with the amount of time somebody can afford to learn to express himself or to become himself. You think of Malcolm Tucker, right, in the thick of it. His job wears him like a skin. Now you have a counterpoint. Dictators can be whoever they want. A paradox, but, well, I mean, they're not good leaders, are they? You have to accept, and here we are moving away from heroism at last. All of us take up space in the world that other atoms could use. Heroes take up more space than others. They justify that by being exceptional or insane, but I repeat myself. Heroes are barbaric because they are more themselves. Barbarism and civilization exist on a spectrum of socialization. Barbarism exists alone. Culture, civilization are predicated on sharing society with others. You can't have a culture of one. The most rarefied thing is a language only one person understands, the language of individual thought, the most barbarian tongue. Civilization, as the word implies, from obviously Latin civis, citizen, it's made opposite to barbarism by its inclusion of other minds. And civilization can only work, and finally we get to our next topic, by hypocrisy. We're all hypocrites. Heroes are shameless hypocrites. Everyone in the world is ridiculous. This makes us dignified. That's another paradox. And everyone is a hypocrite. And that makes us principled. And hopefully it makes us honest. Because we live among civilization, where everything's mediated between everybody, people criticize social constructs, but the whole world's built on them. So you have to be careful about doing that. And that means that we're all necessarily hypocrites. We continue to live in a society filled with people who disagree with us. And we're meant to be that way. Clearly nobody can survive without cognitive dissonance. No person on earth was ever totally consistent. It's inhuman to be that way. It's well known that that's an evolutionary strategy. That ensures survival. Being consistent is of secondary importance compared to twisting around the gaps where you can find them and managing to fit in. Consistency is reserved for logic. It doesn't belong in reality. It belongs in systems of thought that have presuppositions about the ideal modes of human behavior. You hear utopians say things like, if everyone agreed to abide by this, we'd live in a perfectly logical, fair world. Of course, you see the problem with that almost immediately. The impossibility, obviously, of getting an entire society to agree to do something based on logic is impossible, but if it wasn't impossible, it would be dangerous, and it would be extremely unwise. Any society based on logic that could be understood by one person wouldn't be complex enough to account for the needs of all of its citizens. Perfection in society, in a way, should be your enemy. There has to be a distance between the ideal and the reality. There have to be gaps for the diverse ways, the forms human experience can take to fall through. On a related note, I'll say that this principle, logically concluded, says that any god who could be understood by a single human brain would not be capable of ruling the universe. But I stray from the point. I think that you must be a hypocrite. You can't speak for yourself. You can only act for yourself. Only your actions or inactions can be considered true markers of character. We live inside ourselves. We can't externally inspect ourselves. Militancy on behalf of the self-praise, doesn't really have a place for me for that reason. I believe, perhaps to my personal detriment, that one can't fight for or define oneself, only others. You'll hear stories about various Eastern depictions of heaven from the Orthodox, but also further east than that. They'll say it's like a dinner table. It's laden with food, but the forks are too long for you to feed yourself. They're long enough to feed the person across the table. In other words, you need to rely on other people. This is an attitude that I try to adopt. I don't always succeed. I think that there's a difference between intelligence and wisdom. That's pretty obvious, but this is what I think that difference is. Intelligence plays a quite objective role in your life. You'll be creative to this or to that extent. Your calculation skill will be this or that effective. You'll be this or that fast a thinker. I mean, this is plastic to the degree that the brain is plastic, but it's largely established. You wouldn't call it objective, of course. We all know about how malleable IQ tests and all of that sort of thing can be, but it's a kind of measurable quality. Wisdom, on the other hand, and you should strive for wisdom for this reason, it plays a subjective role. What's best from an objective, a logical, an ideological perspective is not always situationally best. This is perhaps another aside. Life isn't to be understood as more or less lived by the commission or the abstinence from any particular act. You die at the end, no matter how hard you party along the way. Everything in life is life. Its interpretation is just a matter of how much you've grown to meet it, to understand life in it. Someone who visits the Grand Canyon every weekend, who's, a Wall Street hotshot, who's involved in a hostage situation, who's a secret agent. If they're sitting around on their phone, okay, well, a secret agent really couldn't be doing that, but if they're not reflecting on their experience, if they're not paying attention to what they're doing, if they don't live in those moments and sort of have self-awareness in moments like that, they live less than somebody who stays at home all day watching anime. If that person reflects on their experience and has the capacity to imagine things that aren't immediately in front of them, I think imagination is only imagination when you're not told to imagine something. I'll make an analogous point here, which could form the topic of another video that I may or may not make. It may be an essay that I put up on my website. Shameless plug. The invisible is only invisible if it doesn't seem to exist. Imagination. To only think what you're told doesn't match the meaning of that term. You need to naturally analogize, naturally think away from where you are and about things that have nothing to do with where you are, except to the people initiated into your vision of life. Ideally, if you want to be a creative sort of person or a philosopher, this far thought should be near constant. A person should have the capacity to be not quite present, exactly, fully, wherever they might be. This is why I don't really accept the Nikos Kazantzakis dichotomy between thought and action. Should you retreat from the world? Should you embrace the world? It doesn't matter. Whether you're an astronaut or just a NEET living in your house, you have the same capacity to live consciously. I think that man is a religious animal. This doesn't mean you need to be a Muslim, you need to be a Christian, you need to pick a side. It means you have an ontology that forms the scope of your perception. Properly conceived, that's all religion is. It's a foundational mental structure. You're religious no matter what you believe. Man is a religious animal. We speak flippantly about religion these days to our detriment. It's the structure of our thought. Remember, it goes mythology, personal mythology built up in childhood, which allows you to start building a history, which allows you to start looking backwards, which allows you to start looking forwards and looking at where you are and doing things based on the people around you. That's wisdom rather than intelligence, which is something that will have you stick to it. Well, okay, it's a spectrum. Obviously, you shouldn't just compromise everything that you believe every time somebody around you disagrees with you, but you should think carefully about whether it's worth fighting every battle. And that's wisdom too. Now, I'm questioning whether I should actually go and have a read of my essay on the invisible, but I don't think I will. I think I'll put it up on my website, and I think if you want to read about what I have to say about things that are invisible, you can go there.